Welcome to Insideout Conversations, the show where women, and particularly Black women, talk about the things we normally don't talk about and only think about. This is Lisa Lackey, your conversation starter. Well, hello. This is Lisa Lackey, and I am your conversation starter. And I am so excited to just really delve into what I've been thinking about a lot. I have been thinking about the interconnectedness of mothers and daughters, not just in a physical way, but in spiritual and emotional ways. I wanted to just share with you how most of us are really consumed by this notion of time and this notion of wanting to separate time by days or weeks or months or generations or hours. So many ways to separate time. And the more that we look and think about the concept of time, we realize that it isn't always exactly how we thought of it. Albert Einstein said the past, present, and future are only illusions, even if stubborn ones. So as I began to travel more frequently back and forth to visit my mother as she ages gracefully, I was noticing a parallel process that was going on between us. As I observed her aging, I observed myself aging. As I observed her aging and as I observed myself aging, I recalled observing my grandmother aging as well, remembering the time that my grandmother was my age now, and remembering the time when my mother was my age now. Usually when I go and visit my mother, there's lots of thoughts, lots of memories, lots of hopes that come up as I prepare to spend time with her. And on my last visit with my mother, I wrote this: thoughts as I travel to go hang out with my 88-year-old mother. In this moment, I realize how similar I am to my mom, beyond the physical, beyond what I can even put my hand on. I remember when my mother was my current age. It seems like yesterday when I was my daughter's age. Then it hit, damn. Before I know it, I will be my mom's age now, by God's grace. And remember back to the age that I am now. And my daughter will be my age now. And remember when I was this age now. And so even if we try to parse out time and compartmentalize time and categorize time, I began to see how all of our times were intertwined into something much bigger than the way that I normally would think of time. And then, with each passing day, I'm overwhelmed with gratitude that enlarges my heart. That gratitude being that I still have my mom. Gratitude that she did and does her work so that it's not passed to me or her grands. Gratitude for all of the Black women that invited me into community at different life stages where I could do and continue to do my own work so that I won't leave it as an inheritance to my children and my grandchildren. Gratitude that my daughter is the fruit of elders and ancestors that declared her blessed before she was. I realized the significance and necessity and assignment to do our work of healing, to do our work of healing so that we do not pass on what is incomplete as an inheritance to our children and our children's children. And I don't believe that this is just related to women that have children, but I believe that all of us as women are constantly birthing and influencing and impacting. And so what we don't heal in us, we pass on to those that we impact and influence. I began to think of healing as paying it forward. Do your work. And as I thought about all of these different markers of time, I realized that those markers actually can be confining. Those markers can actually stunt our growth. Those markers can actually limit our creativity and our thirst and our knowledge to understand more and more of who we are and where we have come from. You see, just like Maya Angelou said, we are phenomenal women, women on assignment to bring forth healthy fruit. And I'm not just talking about physical, but I'm talking about doing the work of healing so that we leave an inheritance of blessing and abundance more and more with each successive generation. I find this fascinating, and many of you may know this already, but even though I learned this some time ago, it never ceases to just stop me in my tracks and consider the limitless sacredness that we as women hold. Before we were conceived, we were as an egg in our mother's ovary. All the eggs of a woman that she will ever carry form while she is 4 months old as a fetus in the womb of her mother. Our cellular life begins in the womb of our grandmother, where generations intermingle and interact and integrate. Before we were, we were. In understanding this, what we come to realize is that each of us has spent 5 months in our grandmother's womb, whether we ever knew our grandmother or not, whether we ever knew our mother or not. And our grandmothers formed within the womb of their grandmother. We vibrate to the rhythms of our mother's blood before she is born. This pulse is the thread of blood that runs all the way back through the grandmothers to the first mother. And these observations were written by a woman named Lane Redmond. And it came from when the drummers were women. So whether we knew our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers to the first mother, there's a rhythm that we have that is not contained in the lifetime that we know of our lifetime. And so before we were conceived, we were. It made me begin to think about the limitless possibilities of the womb and how the womb is held in such high regard in many indigenous cultures. The womb represents the sum total of all possibilities, potentials. It symbolizes abundance. It symbolizes more than enough. The womb symbolizes the seat of our wisdom, our creativity, our power, and our sensuality. When we talk about chakras and the womb, we talk about the sacral chakra and how important it is to balance that sacral chakra, the home of one's sweetness. The womb holds life until life is ready to transition to the next phase. The womb gives birth to promise, to continuity. When we think about this mother line, when we think about the power of life and its creation and the power of the assignment, again, that women carry, it becomes unfathomable. And it makes me think about all the different ways that society and colonialism and white supremacy and all kinds of other things tear at the very thread that is one of our most essential connections. We hear so much about it, and there's so many books written about it, is the dilemma of the mother-daughter relationship. I know that even as a therapist years ago, we talked about, needing to take a break from your mother or your daughter or your grandmother if they were toxic or if they were not supportive or if they infringed on the growth that you were trying to have. There was another, though, Bowen, and Bowen came up with the understanding of Bowen family systems. And his belief was that wherever we were experiencing difficulty in relationship, other than being physically harmed in any way, that it was best to try to grow within that relationship so that you could differentiate rather than disconnect. When we started to become more successful, as the world counts success, when we started to begin to live in different cities and states and maybe even countries, and distance grew and grew and grew, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually, we often forgot that which brought us forth in life. When we are disconnected from our mothers, when we are severed in those relationships, there's a part of us that can't grow. There's a part of us that can't push through. There's a part of us that has difficulty living beyond the womb into the fullness, into the creativity, into the wisdom, into the abundance. And yet we live in a world where independence is a large, revered badge of honor. And for some, it's not that they didn't want to connect or that they do not want to connect. For some, that was not an option. As we became more and more sophisticated and disconnected, kind of threw away some of our traditional practices. They were no longer convenient. They were no longer, in many cases, accepted. They were no longer honored. In the 50s and 60s, women were encouraged more and more to introduce baby formula to their children. And this isn't about a right or a wrong. It's an individual choice. And the way that it was presented in many cases, particularly in our culture, our Black culture, outsiders saw the formula as a much better option, a replacement to unsanitary breasts. So what would have become a nurturing time, a bonding time, a skin-to-skin time, began to be shunned. Births were mostly in the home because for so long there were no hospitals for Black people to have their children in. And before there were hospitals, there were doulas and midwives without even being called that helped to bring that child to birth. And when that became outdated, when the world began and the validity of that and the progressiveness of having your child in a hospital, those home births became less and less. And what many of them were replaced with were cold, strange, and often dangerous hospitals. We all know the infant mortality rate and the death among Black mothers during pregnancy, childbirth, or up to a year after childbirth is significantly higher than those of white women that might encounter some of the same challenges. We are carriers of our mother's stories, and the grace of life shows us a path to heal what they were unable to. As I return home from visiting my mother, especially in the last probably 8 years, each year it becomes more and more difficult to go and more difficult to leave. There's so much that has been communicated and so much that has not. There are parts of her story that I am just learning because my life was so busy and the things I had to do were so important. And I didn't want to hear those stories as a younger woman, that they were boring or repetitive. And when I think about that, when my mother was in her mother's womb, I shared that womb with her. We have a rhythm that is timeless and yet unknown in so many ways. I wonder why not only do we look alike, but our movements are similar, our thoughts are similar, our strengths and our insecurities are similar. Our stories are similar. Those challenges that we've encountered are similar. But yet, the more and more sophisticated we became, and the more and more we left tradition and culture as a way of trying to fit in, we also stopped sharing as much. We also stopped hearing as much. We started to lose parts of the story, and other parts we didn't even care about, and then other parts we believed as shameful. And so we pretended that those parts were not parts of our story. And yet they cannot be released or forgotten, because even if they're not conscious, the memories are in our bodies. We talk a lot about intergenerational trauma, and it is a fact. And we can see how it's not just an intellectual understanding of intergenerational trauma that we have to pursue, but we have to acknowledge that before we were born, we existed, and we existed in a shared womb. And that shared womb was connected to many other shared wombs, all the way back until the first mother. And so we could not help but inherit. And I believe that the further and further we grew away from the stories and sitting with one another and honoring our mothers and acknowledging and revering their position of queen, we started to lose pieces of ourselves. We started to lose pieces of ourselves as individuals, as women, as nurturers, as partners, and who we were no longer was, because we became what we thought was needed to matriculate in a world that did not value the mother line, that did not honor the sacredness, that did not understand the rhythm of our souls and ourselves, replicate those rhythms from which we came from. And so I often think about if the disconnection was the, or at least one of the most important factors in experiencing the imbalance and the dysregulation of trauma that was reverberating through generations. The level of shame started to increase because who we became, we thought we were, and we lost, in many regards, who we actually are. And so there is this kind of wind that is blowing through, I believe, the entire universe, and definitely the earth, that is calling us to come home, and not to those homes that we have created, not those homes that we have spent extraordinary amounts of time and money and energy to perfect on the outside. But in a sense, it's a coming home to our origin, to our first beginnings, and attuning our ears and our hearts and our very cells and the being of our being to the depth and the resonance of those historical rhythms of our mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers, and on and on and on to the first mother. And I believe that as we become more curious and open to returning home to who we are, who we've always been, but lost in many ways, that not only will we hear the reverberation of the impact of disconnection, trauma, but we will begin to hear and remember the rhythm and the reverberation of the blessing, of the greatness, of the abundance, of the creativity, of the unlimitedness that each of us carries, and that each of us has a responsibility to pass on. And the passing on becomes easier and more fluid the more we begin to heal the burden and the pain and the distress of disconnection. And so I thought of that as I was leaving my mom recently. I thought of returning home. And normally I think of that as returning to my physical home. But this time I thought about how desirous and how hungry I was and am to return home to myself, which can only be accomplished by being open and willing to make room for reconnection, to make room for transformation, to make room for a wholeness that I've been searching for all my life, but externally rather than through connection. There was this time in my life where I remember it so vividly, and not just in my mind, but in my body. I was at a group meditation, and we were meditating, and there were only 2 people in the room that I knew out of probably 30 people. And during that meditation, I met my maternal great-grandmother. In my lifetime, in the physical realm, I never knew her. I've seen many pictures of her. I've heard stories about her, but I'd never met her. But I was always, something inside of me was always hungering for some sort of connection with her. And that evening in that meditation, I met her. the presence of her, the essence of her, the beingness of her. I felt her. And in feeling her and in connecting with her, I began to connect with myself in a way that I hadn't before. I began to feel a belongingness in my own being that I had never felt before. I felt loved in a way that I hadn't felt before. Not that I hadn't been loved, I certainly was, but it was a depth that I hadn't experienced. And from that time, she's always been with me. Her presence has been with me in a felt way, not just in my mind. And through that, I've come to put pieces together about my grandmother, who I did know, who I did spend lots of time with. But some of the stories she had learned not to tell as well. And as I began to see some of those pieces coming together that I never understood before related to my grandmother, I began to see so many pieces come together as it related to my mother and her life and her story and her choices. And as my mother still lives, I have the opportunity to ask her questions. And yet, there are these times when I hesitate, when I hold back. And what I began to realize is that as much connection as I want and as much connection as I believe God means us to have, that connection, that level of intimacy, that level of vulnerability is scary. Because in knowing her, I know more of who I am. And in knowing more of who I am, those compartmentalized pieces start to come together and integrate, and I become more and more who I am and less who I created myself to be, to adapt to all the disconnections that life can bring. Returning home, I realized that in this time, as we understand lifetime, chances are I will not be able to touch my mother, kiss her forehead, and watch her walk and see her aging and glean wisdom from her. I realize that relationship will become one that I have with my great-grandmother and ancestors before, and my grandmother. One of spirit, one of essence, one of opportunity for unlimited connection. And yet, it is so difficult, viscerally painful to think about the disconnection, the physical disconnection that happens when we transition from this life, that one day, and more than likely, one day sooner than I would ever want, my relationship with my mother will become the spirit of my mother, the essence of my mother, the beingness of my mother. And it is also true for my children with me. And so my hope for myself and for you, whether your mother is living on this side of life or not, that we would begin to become curious as little innocent children to understand the connection of our beingnesses, to understand the formation of our beingness, to understand what to keep and what to release, and always what to learn from those lifetimes of lifetimes. So I'd like you to think about the rhythm that is in you. Think about the rhythm that predates your even being conceived. The rhythm, the flow, the movement, and the origins of that rhythm. And as we become more and more curious about that, I believe that gift of abundance, creativity, nurture, power, leadership will flow with less and less impediment with every generation, because we are connecting to our stories and we're understanding that all of the parts are beautiful. All of the parts were necessary. All of the parts of the story resonate in such a way that as we tap in, home will never be a place that we are without. And connection to our roots will never be tethered. And the inheritance that we leave those that we either have birthed through our bodies or other ways of impact and influence will only have the work that is theirs, no longer having to carry baggage that is not their own. It was picked up and even identified as mine, but it only became mine, and ours will only become our children's if we are unwilling to carry that which is ours, to carry it through to transformation, to abundance, to life, and to light. Understanding that how that will look is not up to us, but how it will change us can only be known as we do our work. And so as you think about going to your mother's house, whether you've ever been there or not, whether she's dead or alive, whether you knew her or didn't know her, when you think about going there, think about how all of the lives are one and intertwined. And think about realizing not just the differences and not just the physical similarities, but the shared time, the shared space, even before you were conceived. So I hope that this will be something that you'll come back to and pull out what really hits you today. Thanks so much for listening. I would love to hear from you. On Instagram, I'm at Insideout Conversations. And you can always email through our general address, and those will come to me, admin, ADMIN, at insideoutrecovery.com. And LinkedIn, you can just find me under Lisa Braxton Lackey or Inside Out Living. Peace, peace, peace. Have a great week. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll share this podcast with a friend. Leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're listening on our website, insideoutrecovery.com, please leave a comment. Join our Facebook community, The Inside Out Life. You can also follow us on Instagram, Inside Out Conversations. This podcast is edited by the team at the Creative Impostor Studios.